I wanted to get online today to address the infamous line that often gets thrown around in dating, which is, they're just not that into you. I'll take the time to explain it. I'll take the time to explain what I've noticed when this is actually a thing. And I'll try helping everyone by comparing it to people who have avoidant attachment, because I don't want people necessarily thinking they're one and the same, because they're not. For a bit of context, I feel like this phrase, they're just not that into you, gets thrown around so damn much. And we end up using it as a very poor oversimplification to understand complex human behavior. And then there are times where actually this is the case, that we're just not that into someone. And I will discuss the distinctions and make sure that we're all on the same page. I'm sure people may agree, some may not. I don't particularly care. It's one of those things where I think this is just worth unpacking for everyone's sake, because it's a very confusing and complicated space out here in the human world that we live in. So, if you have any questions for me, regardless of what the topic is about, feel free to put them in the chat below. I will get to them later. Anyways, not only the chat, by the way, the question mark box too. So, when someone says, like, they're just not that into you, I think that in my experience, what I've noticed, if I paint an example, is, let's say Jim has been going out with Jill. Jim has been giving messages to Jill being like, you know, you're more than just my friend, right? Oh, but I don't want you calling me your boyfriend. And when you hear this, you know, as a third party, I'm sure many of us have been looking in on this situation, would tell Jill as well-intentioned friends, well, clearly if he's saying that, he doesn't like you enough to want to actually make you his girlfriend. Is that really what's actually going on? Or could there actually be something else going on? And I think that we understandably rush to this logical conclusion because many of us who've grown up with the concept that love is something to be earned may look at Jill's situation as an example and think that, well, if she was sexier, smarter, more mature, then maybe Jim would actually be into her and wouldn't have such a hang-up about making her his girlfriend. And look, I get it. I think that a lot of people relate earning love to a lot of situations and think that that is the definition for how a lot of this works, when in reality, it doesn't quite work like that. But I understand where a lot of people come from when they say things like, well, clearly in this case, Jim is just not that into you. And the flip side is that there is actually a real version of when someone is not into someone. Let's say that we change the scenario around. Jim and Jill are two completely different individuals. In this experience, Jill's been going out with Jim for a handful of dates, and she continues to go out and she just feels that there's nothing there. We're talking no chemistry, no emotional connection, no depth. She thinks that Jim is great. He ticks all the boxes. He's kind, compassionate, consistent, texts regularly, not too much, not too little. He'll always discuss things with her. But after 2 months of even, engaging with this, person, maybe having sex, she just feels the same way. In fact, if anything, she just sort of feels like, I'd rather be at home eating crisps. And nothing is really evolving. It just sort of feels like she's waiting for something to land and it's just not happening. And she talks to her friends about this and is just like, I just don't know what's wrong with me. This guy seems to have everything on paper and I'm just not sure why I'm not into this person. And this is, in my experience, professionally speaking and personally speaking, is when, unfortunately, you don't actually like this person emotionally. They can be a good person, but you're just not into them. And this is very much the real, you're just not into them. The other variation that might happen for anxious attachers is that they start having a lot of nervous doubts about someone. Typically, we find that anxious attachers also have a fear of commitment, but it's very subtle. Basically, what we find is that for anxious attachers, if we use the Jill and Jim example again too, I apologize that this is very heteronormative, but you can probably apply this across LGBTQI plus spaces as well. Let's just put it like this. Jill has been going out with Jim for a while. Jim is really kind, consistent, loving, and even though she likes Jim, she just keeps thinking, oh my God, like, why is he giving me this love? Like, I feel like I haven't earned this yet. I feel like I'm just getting the ick. Like, it just feels weird. Like, it just feels like it's too much. And I don't feel good about, getting this amount of attention from someone this early on. I feel like I need to earn this. This is an example of the anxious attachment side of commitment phobia, where in this particular example, Jill is exhibiting anxiety over actually being in a committed relationship because maybe for her, she's used to fireworks. She's used to men just, having to work for it, for, her to feel like she has to work for love. And this is another example of commitment phobia, not an actual example of she's just not that into him. It's really important in dating to discern, is this anxiety or is this your intuition? And people notoriously get the two confused all the time. A lot of people take hormones, the butterflies, excitement, and anxiety as they interpret a lot of these emotions as clear indicators as to what's going on between them and another person. And those loud emotions aren't always reliable at the best of times. For example, for the avoidant attacher who's getting closer to someone and is getting more intimate, typically, as I've said many times, they get really flooded with a lot of anxiety as they get closer to an individual where they start doubting everything, and it feels hellish because they don't have outlets much of the time to process their anxiety, and it makes them feel like this is not the right thing for them to do, and it becomes a full mind-body episode and a massive panic attack. The anxious attacher on the flip side of the spectrum can also go through their own doubts when they're dating someone who actually could be quite good for them because they're not used to this steadiness and also to the calmness of the person they're with. And this can also cause them to have a lot of confusion, being like, oh my God, like what is up with, this person? And it may seem like they're actually trying to destroy this person before they've actually had a chance to get to know them. Then we have the elusive third category for this, where it's just a case of, I'm not feeling anything. A lot of the time, people with insecure attachment are racing, barreling ahead, trying to build intimacy with another person very quickly. And the danger of that is that they often miss out on some very relevant bits of information for themselves to discern whether or not this is someone they want to actually get to know. But in saying that, there may be instances where you end up dating people who have a lot of great qualities and traits, and even in spite of all the compatibility boxes that they tick, you will just simply not have any form of connection or chemistry with them because nothing comes out of it. I hate to break it to you, but based on my experience and also what I've seen with some of my clients, we're just not going to be made for some people, and it is what it is. I wish we could love everyone equally, but unfortunately biology didn't seem to want to work that way, so we're meant for some people, not for others. So that's a bit of a thing there. But I want to just take a moment to put that to one side for a minute and just to reassure anyone who's going through the thick of a situation where someone might actually be dating an individual with avoidant attachment, to say, I know how hard it is to be battling your head when you're dating someone like this, because much of the time you're ruminating on whether or not this is even real. Or if you've been broken up, you'll be ruminating and debating, am I in a dream? Did this person actually care for me or even like me at all? Did they ever love me? Did they mean what they said? Or was it all fake? Did they just abruptly leave and go because they never really cared for me at all? And if they wanted me, they would. So let's talk about commitment phobia for the avoidant attachment, because I think it's really important to break this down for people so that way they can have a bit of reassurance around this situation. Let's go back to Jill and Jim. Let's say Jim's been going out with Jill for a very long time, and Jill has been telling Jim, I really enjoy spending time with you. You give me love like no one else before. You're so kind to me. I've never experienced such kindness before. And I could really see myself, being in a committed relationship with you or even marrying you. Then, as Jim and Jill are talking about entering into a committed relationship, Jill says, oh, I'd love you to be my boyfriend. But by the way, don't you think it's just hard for us because, most relationships and marriages, they end in failure and divorce. And Jim doesn't really take much notice of this. He just reassures her, hey, we'll find ways to make this work. We'll go to therapy. We'll do what's necessary to ensure, with communication, that we can work on this together to not be one of those individuals where it doesn't work out. And then everything seems fine off the back of that. Then the following day, Jill says to him in a text, yeah, I just can't do this anymore and I've got to go and I just don't think I was ever really in love with you. Okay, pretty confusing stuff, right? And a lot of people, understandably, who might be listening to a story like this, who've never gone through that, they might be thinking, oh, well, maybe in this particular situation, you know, she just didn't love him as much as he seemingly did. And I'm here to say that is not the case. Commitment phobia is insidious. It's really, really bad, and it really wrecks a lot of great relationships between people. When you are someone with avoidant attachment, usually you are very, well, not all, but a lot of them are usually very, very, very into a person who they're getting to know. They love sharing their stuff. They might like getting to know you. They really like the fantasy aspects of the relationship. A conversation for another day will be talking about what they like versus what they don't, but one of the key aspects to know about this is that when they're in it, they're absolutely in it. But when they take a step back and they are really starting to feel their feelings for someone, this is what causes them much of the time a surge or a growing build-up of uncontrollable anxiety. I have had avoidant clients tell me, yeah, my brain just raced to the first thing I could think of as to why I didn't like this person. I was destroying them in my head. They weren't brushing their teeth a certain way. They just didn't look like what I thought I needed from a type of person. They just spoke funny. I thought that they came from a weird educational background. They liked hiking, but I don't like hiking. And so I ran with that and just did it in a whatever communication form or otherwise in order to just get away from this situation. So I'm not excusing the fallout of what happens. Well, I think we all know what happens when you've had a breakup with an avoidant attacher. It's best time ever. But I'm here to say that in a moment of distress, and I understand it looks different because for a lot of avoidant attachers, they may not look physically distressed. I just want to say, for the sake of this explanation, that anxiety is a bitch. And when it takes over someone, I'm no stranger to this experience, it will destroy good relationships if it is not regulated well. I myself have made terrible decisions when I'm in a state of anxious flare-ups. Normally I can handle, on a scale of 1 to 7, the average bit of anxiety, but when it goes between 8 to 10, good luck to my wallet. I typically spend shit on things that I don't need. It's not a pretty sight. And when it comes to the avoidant attacher in a romantic relationship where they're going through this, I just want to say, please bear in mind that in this instance, it's usually not a case of that example that I was describing of they never actually felt anything for you at all. Much of the time, you can feel that enthusiasm. In my experience, energy never lies. If you're with someone where you feel a lot of that positive affection and you also get the impression that they're really into you, chances are it's pretty real. Chances are it's pretty genuine. Chances are that it's pretty, intense. And there is actually a lot of, good feeling there. But usually our bodies are very wise, and we also pick up on a lot of their stuff as well too. Think about it like this. Why do you think you're often sometimes feeling a bit anxious when you're dating an individual like this, when you're getting this amount of intensity? Sometimes it can be because these individuals are also suppressing a lot of their own anxiety and their own concerns. Many a person has confronted their avoidant partner pre-shutdown and asked them, hey, is everything okay? I just want to know we're on the same page and everything's good, because I get the impression that things might have shifted a little bit. I'm feeling a bit of coldness. Is everything okay? And much of the time, they don't have the skill set to actually communicate and talk about their stuff. So we end in situations where obviously their partner is left thinking, okay, maybe it's just my imagination. I want to make it clear that avoidant attachers do not like really disclosing the fact that they have any major emotional difficulties at all. Dealing with emotions can be seen as a sign of weakness. It can be regarded as a vulnerability that they don't necessarily want to disclose to anyone. And as a consequence, it means that they may be very guarded about actually, sharing what's coming up. And so they will usually resort to excuses. Much of the time when they've shut down, it can be game over for the relationship or the situationship. In some cases, it's usually a dismissive avoidant experience where if the person has severe dismissive avoidant attachment, the relationship will go for a very long time, but there'll be lots of hot and cold episodes, and usually their partner might be the one to break up with them because it just becomes too painful. But generally speaking, in my experience and from what I've seen with a lot of my clients, we find that for the avoidant attacher who's going through this amount of anxiety, they're not open to negotiation when they're shutting down. They may not even be open to talking to you. Hell, they may even block you. When someone is doing that level of irrational behavior, chances are it's not just a change of mind that came out of, that's been there since the beginning of the time that they've known you. I think that a lot of people with avoidant attachment, due to a lot of their own shame and guilt over what's happened, have a tendency to rewrite history and to also say things like, well, people can change their minds all the time. Yeah, Jill, I just thought that she wasn't smart enough for me. Yeah, with Jim, I thought that he just simply, wasn't the type of guy that I would normally go out with. Even if both of those statements aren't necessarily true in light of the experience they were having. One thing that I've come across, which I actually found really practical, was the books written by Stephen Carter, who is a former individual with avoidant attachment. And he made a really good point in, I believe it's his appendix of He Scared, She Scared, where he says to anyone who has active commitment issues or avoidant attachment, you need to eventually own the truth of all your relationships. You cannot keep slicing, dicing, compartmentalizing all those romantic experiences that you've had with your partners and acting like they didn't matter or they didn't exist. One of the most brutal aspects of a breakup with an avoidant attacher is the way they cut you out of history as if neither of you ever actually existed. Some of them won't, but for the very severe ones, they want to get away from you. They want to get away from ever knowing that they actually had a relationship with you because there can be a lot of shame and guilt over what's happened. And at worst, they may blame you to try and make them feel better so they can maintain the ego of being a good person. So I just wanted to illustrate that because it's really important that people get it. If you're going through a healing journey right now and all of this kind of behavior still does your head in and you're still feeling incredibly confused by avoidant behavior, I want you to understand that you don't need to understand all of this in order to heal. Maybe for you, it's just bad behavior. Maybe for you, you get to a point where you're like, I've had enough of actually being treated this way and I don't want to be treated by confusion and seemingly someone who can't actually get their mental health right. Because at the end of the day, it's not fair to you. For those of you who are still doubting whether or not this was real, well, if you think of it like this, if you were truly dating someone who truly didn't have strong feelings for you and they let it go for that long, that person is still, regardless of attachment style, needs serious therapy. Think about it like this. If a person you were dating truly put on a show and had done all these kind gestures, summoned these emotions out of the ether, and had just decided to take you for this wild ride where seemingly all of a sudden it just evaporated, and they were like, yeah, I never had feelings for you. Like, okay, if that's truly the case, and it wasn't an attachment issue at all, what a psycho. I mean, I know that sounds harsh coming from a mental health professional, but my point to you guys is simply to say, like, why would anyone go to that effort to waste time with someone like that? Usually people, particularly those who are more in those cluster B, dark tetrad types, can be very exploitative. They can do a lot of things that are very Machiavellian. But I just think, what a waste of time for someone to do that. Yes, there are examples, unfortunately, of people who may do a variation of this, where there are usually people who've come from very abusive relationships and they just want to be with someone safe and they acquiesce to be with someone without saying no and saying, I'm actually just not that into you, because they have a lot of people-pleasy tendencies, and they stick it out in a relationship where they don't really love their partner. That can happen. There are some individuals who are with partners where they just don't know what love is. They never did, and they just think, oh, is this it? I mean, I'm not really feeling anything. And that's seemingly the way it goes for some individuals. It can be a case of ignorance for some people, and that's just how it goes for them. But that is very different from when you viscerally feel all this emotion coming from another person, where there's a 180 as a consequence of their shutting down. Big difference between that and someone who is never feeling it from day zero. Please understand that it is very normal for a lot of people to experience a multitude of emotions or none in dating and relationships, but I think there is a very distinctive difference between someone who never felt anything versus someone who had a wild roller coaster of emotions due to emotional dysregulation and commitment phobia. So, as I'm rounding this little piece up before I answer the questions, I just want to remind everybody again that when it comes to this old issue of they're just not that into you, please bear in mind that every person's situation can be very different. The more you date and get to know yourself, the more you'll actually realize what's truly a case of you're just not into that person versus you dated someone with commitment phobia. And though your inner critic may love to join the dots and say, well, clearly if they liked you enough, they'd want to be with you, I'm here to just remind your inner critic that trying to be the high achiever in dating is a recipe for disaster. It's a self-worth thing. I highly recommend you speak to a therapist, all rooted in complex post-traumatic stress disorder, usually a sign that you're trying to prove that you're lovable. Don't recommend doing that. Just putting that out there. I'm someone who's saying that to myself as much as to everyone else here. I've done that too. I'm very guilty. So just wanted to put that out there. All right, let's get into the questions. If you have any questions for me, feel free to put them in the question mark box or just throw them into the chat. I will get through them as best I can before I pop off for the evening. Okay, so let's get into it. Why do some people act like it's a relationship until it's time to be official? Good question. I think that for some people, if specifically for avoidance, because I feel like this is very true for avoidant attachers. Anxious attachers can do this too. I'll see if I can do a comparison. I think people with insecure attachment have a bad tendency at times, depending on their upbringing, of over-relating to people, meaning that some individuals may trauma dump, may also try and force intimacy on people, and it feels like you're actually having a much more romantic experience with that person. And I think a lot of this can come from having poor boundaries from caregivers. It can also come from maybe feeling like you're not good enough, so you constantly need to sort of throw yourself onto someone new. And really, a lot of this does come from trauma because you're not really able to create boundaries, space, respect for yourself or for the other person. We might see the anxious attacher who is becoming this is one example of an anxious attacher. Not every anxious attacher is like this. One example could be the anxious attacher who's becoming very clingy, very codependent on the person that they're with and needs them to basically do everything for them. For the avoidant, maybe more of a fearful avoidant, or an avoidant who'd had a lot of emotional incest, they might start talking about, how bad their marriage is, how bad their relationships have been, how terrible their mother is, their father, and they keep emotionally dumping, and it feels like they're actually getting a bit closer. I want to make a big warning here, if you're on either end of this. When someone is crossing the line where they're relating to you like you're their therapist, you're their parent, you have entered the realm of a trauma bond. This is not healthy for either of you. And it can be very easy to interpret, for example, the avoidant attacher's emotional dumpings as a sign that they want to get emotionally close to you, when in fact, even though they may, in a way, want connection and closeness, they're not equipped to deal with connection and closeness. The anxious attacher may be looking to you as a bit of a surrogate in terms of taking care of their emotional neediness, not healthy. So please bear in mind that in these particular cases, a lot of this can come from a lot of maladaptive childhood experiences. It's not a healthy sign by any stretch of the imagination. I hope you're getting better. Yes, okay, quick health update just for anyone who's wondering. So just for a bit of an understanding, the chronic health issue that I'm going through is just related to my liver. I've just got non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and it's gotten to the stage where, let's put it like this, if action's not taken, it's going to be critical. So even though I have the energy at the moment to actually be here and do the thing, I'm just letting everyone know, without going into further details, that that's the thing that I'm dealing with on the side. I am working through it. I've got a team helping me out, so just letting everyone know that. Are avoidant attachers aware they're shutting down their feelings for you, or it happens in a more unconscious way? Mine told me I've already rationalized and compartmentalized you in our relationship. Thanks in advance. Okay, great question. In my experience, the commitment phobia, that shutting down, can often be very involuntary, meaning that it's often their brain's way of just trying to protect them from growing intimacy and closeness. So typically I find that for the avoidant attacher, this is how the thoughts would play out. I really like this person. I'm getting really close to this person. Oh God, oh shit. Like if we get together, this is not going to work out well. I actually think I want to keep dating. There are probably going to be other people out there that I'm much better with. I just think this person doesn't have the right hygiene for me. No, this isn't right. I just don't think that we're actually meant to be together. If I'm feeling this way, clearly we're not meant to be together. And I think that maybe it's just for the best if we break up. They have a very big stream of consciousness that often dictates the next actions that they will take when it comes to their partner. So in doing that, their brain is often from their limbic system, their fight or flight, working their strategy out of this relationship or situationship. So much of the time, this very uncontrollable anxiety is often the culprit for a lot of this. I mean, alongside a lot of other things like trauma. But the point simply is to say that in my experience, it's often a big involuntary thing, and it is not something that they have a lot of control over. A lot of these people don't have the regulation skills. A lot of them don't know how to access help. A lot of them have shame for actually having these big experiences, and they don't want to acknowledge that they have these problems. Many of them are perfectionists. They don't want to feel like they've got an issue worth exposing like this. Let's see, what else have we got here? Is it common that dismissive avoidants never take photos of you as a couple? Yes. My dismissive avoidant of 12 years never did. Oh yeah, why share a relationship with you? Because for them to do that, that would mean including you as part of their lives. And a lot of them don't necessarily want to do that because they're still trying to hold out. So yes, unfortunately, it is very common for dismissive avoidants to do that. And I understand that there are going to be people who maybe go, but in my last case, my ex got with a new partner and they were taking photos all the time. I want to just make a moment here to say, if that's the case, usually the avoidant attacher in that scenario was probably not doing any photos with you when they were getting closer with you, got with the next person, and if they're doing that, it's usually to try and prove to the world they don't have a commitment issue. A lot of the time when they double down on the photos on social media, it's to try and prove that there's not an issue in sight and that everything's all good now. That relationship with the new person probably isn't even very functional to begin with. So I'm just putting it out there to say, please be very mindful what you see on social media, because that is not always an accurate description of what's going on inside of that person. Change doesn't happen that quickly. Let's see, what do we got here? I wasn't ready for Jill discarding Jim like that. It hit way too close to home. I feel hurt realizing how generic my experience actually was. Nothing I could have done, right? Okay, no. I want to take a moment here. This is my belief. You don't all have to agree with me on this, but I kind of had to make peace with the fact that in some of these situations, these cases are inevitable. I understand that there are some, there are other accounts out there, like Anxious Hearts Guides, plenty of other accounts where they talk about the successes of being able to create a relationship between an avoidant attacher and an anxious attacher to become secure. To which I say, wonderful. It's not always going to work for people. And we can't always account for the stages in life between two individuals. One person may be requiring more intimacy, the other person may be afraid of intimacy. It's not always going to be down just to the attachment style. It's also down to the self-awareness, the self-growth, the willingness, the accountability of each of those people. It's so more complicated than just, can these two people, besides their attachment style, work on this? It's honestly a question for, each and every individual couple. And that's why, even though, don't get me wrong, I think Anxious Hearts Guides has great advice here and there with regards to their stuff, it's important to understand discernment. In my experience with a lot of the client cases that I've seen, I'm just going to say no. It's very 50-50 in the sense that if they're wanting to work on this and actually to work on this, great. But I want to just say, as a bit of a horror story, a lot of the client cases that I've heard where the avoidant attacher may show glimpses of opening up, it can actually snap back with much greater avoidancy off the back of it because it can cause them to shut down harder and faster. So all I'm saying is discernment for each and every individual's case is really important, and I'm a huge fan of the word context because not everyone's situation is the same. So just putting it out there. Let me go back to the questions. Let's see. Can someone be a fearful avoidant if they openly talk about their feelings? He was very hot and cold. Oh yeah. If a fearful avoidant attacher is talking about some of their feelings like, I feel numb inside, or I feel, scared, or I feel this emotion, that emotion. Yeah, that can happen too. A lot of avoidant attachers may have what I mentioned before, which is alexithymia, which means they're not able to identify, recognize, or articulate their emotions. That's a big thing. But a lot of these individuals, like the fearful avoidants, they're typically more attuned to their emotions because of the fact that they display that more fear of abandonment, anxious attached side of them too. So in those kind of cases, they actually may be more attuned to some of their emotions, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily good or equipped to deal with those surges of big emotions when they come up. Let me paint a picture of a fearful avoidant situation. Let's say we use, and I'm going to make a less heteronormative example this time. Let's say there's Greg and James. James is dating Greg, and Greg and James are two cities apart, but not too far enough to the point where it's not workable. And Greg is sending messages to James being like, I don't know if I can handle this. You keep, just the thought of having to wait to see you is just doing my head, and I don't know if I can handle this. I'm experiencing so much anxiety around this. And James might be feeling really, disturbed by Greg's comments. They might be saying, hey, look, I can support you through this. I'm sure we can make it work. But then Greg goes off the handle and goes, no, I just think you're going to leave me and it's not going to work out. This is too hard for me to do. I just think that we need to end this now. And so James reassures Greg that everything's fine, everything's hunky-dory, it's all going to work out. And Greg calms down. And maybe this episode happens a couple more times. But then, as they're getting closer and Greg's like, oh, I'd love for us to talk about moving in together. I'm thinking maybe what we can do is get you to come over to my state and we can be together and make it all work out. And as James is developing the plans to actually move in with Greg, all of a sudden, Greg just goes, yeah, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. No, I just don't think that we see the world the same way. I think that everything's just completely shifted for us. You're not even going to get along with my family. We just have two different lifestyles. And in that particular instance, it's the avoidant attached side that's coming out. That side is the very dominant side that is very dangerous because that is the side that is much harder to work through and to overcome. So in that particular scenario that I painted, you can see that Greg does display demonstrations of being able to identify that he's anxious about a particular situation happening related to abandonment. But when they go into that shutdown due to growing intimacy and commitment, that may be where things take a turn for the worse and they're just out of their mind and out of their body. So that's why I just wanted to display that can be an example of someone who has fearful avoidant attachment style. What are signs they have permanently detached? Oh, we might be here for a while if I go through all of those. Okay, it's a great question. Permanently is that's a bit of a hard word to use because it implies like they've lost feelings for you forever, which is not always the case. In fact, I'd say it's never the case. So let me just basically describe the signs that they've shut down so that way we can really go through them. The classic ones, the robot expression where it just feels like you're talking to a stranger. They become really cold, impassive, and it seems like they've lost all feeling for the world at large, including yourself and the relationship. That's one. Two, they are crying and simultaneously saying, I've got to go and I'm so sorry. And they're telling you all these reasons as to why they've got to go. And it's really getting quite intense. Another one might be where, and those of you who've watched me for a while will know this sort of stuff, where they start spewing out a lot of rationalizations for why this won't work. Like the infamous one, you like hiking, but I don't like hiking. We have two separate ways of living. I just don't think we can make this work. You're a morning person, I'm an evening person. I'm actually an introvert and you're an extrovert. So if you're getting those rationalizations over a text, over coffee, over dinner, over, the phone, I'd say, just putting it out there and saying that I think that it's important to understand that at that particular moment, the avoidant attacher is checking out. Further to that, we often see that for the avoidant attacher, once they've shut down, some other signs would be that they start distancing themselves from you to the point where they may, at worst, block you across social media, but they'll usually do it in weird ways. They might block you on Facebook, and then eventually a month later on Instagram, and then all of a sudden they'll block you on TikTok, or it can be extreme on everything. It could also be that they start escalating things quite badly, imposing restraining orders, claiming that you're being too nosy, and that can be another one as well too. If they start also, as I can see Science Night's written here, which is great, rewriting history, saying things like, we were never in love, we were just infatuated. It's like, okay, well, that was the best non-infatuated sex that I've ever had in my life, but okay, if that's what you say. It doesn't really go against all the times you told me how much you love me and it really felt like you did. So, funny that. So they're usually the signs that they're shutting down. I'm just trying to think of any others that I can really reflect on. If they suddenly leave your place and they take all their things, maybe if they also hold on to a couple of your items and don't return them, that can happen as well too. I've had clients who've had their teddy bears kept by their avoidant partner. Don't ask me why. I mean, I know why. They've also had house keys being taken, clothes and stuff. You name it. So yeah, they'd probably be the general signs of this. It's very sudden. There's no, the pre-sign, if you're lucky enough to get this, is obviously when you feel them pulling away. Usually, you'll have had a great time together, great date, great sex, wonderful conversation about where the future of your relationship is going. You're getting married tomorrow. You're actually having the chance to move in together. You're talking about having kids and you're ready to draw up the whole plan for that, when all of a sudden, I just don't feel like I can do this anymore. And you may get a period where they just start to step back a little bit. So, just wanted to put that out there and say that it's, there's some of the signs. So I hope that makes sense. I may do a video on this explaining a lot of it because they're usually the same in my experience, but of course they may play out differently depending from person to person. Where does a trauma bond between an anxious and avoidant rank in relation to avoidance getting triggered by closeness and shutdown? Is it one or the other, or do the lines blur? Ooh. Okay. I think I need to distinguish here. So for those of you that don't know what a trauma bond is, a trauma bond in my words is basically where you have a dysfunctional pattern of relating to one another and you're exhibiting behavior that has come from childhood that may not actually be in your, let's just say, your well-being. And it's also causing you distress, harm, and mental and emotional, issues in the long run. There may be physical issues too. I also want to make a clarification here. I see so many people online saying, well, a trauma bond is love bombing, devaluing, discarding, as shown by narcissistic relationships. And I'm here to say that is one variation of a trauma bond, but it is not the entirety of the spectrum of trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is literally as it sounds. You're not bonding over your trauma, but you are being bonded by trauma, meaning your behavior, which is usually protest behavior, and also, maladaptive behavior, is coming together in a really dysfunctional way. Anyways, so where does it, let me go back to the question. So where does a trauma bond between an anxious and avoidant rank in relation to avoidance getting triggered by closeness and shutdown? When I hear that, it almost sounds like I'm ranking like where it is in terms of like, is it like really bad or is it really good? Maybe to answer this, I'll say, where does it relate? Because trauma bonds are different in terms of the way they show up in a relationship, I think that the way I would describe this, like if I had to play it out with this example of like when it's getting close, is I would say that it's not a trauma bond for the avoidant and the anxious person necessarily in the early stages of dating if they're getting together and everything's hunky-dory. Maybe a version of a trauma bond would be that the avoidant partner is with someone who's wildly anxiously attached, very disruptive and destructive in their behavior, and it's getting to a stage where there's shouting matches, physical abuse from the anxious attacher hurting the avoidant partner. The avoidant partner has also been pulling away, and that's also been exacerbating the anger and the tension in the relationship as well. There's shutdowns, and also there's cheating on both sides. Now that's an extreme example of a trauma bond, right? But maybe if we go to the more common example that I talk about here would be, say, let's just say you're both civil, everything's fine. I'd say that in this particular instance, you know, the trauma bond, I think, really would start, if I'm being completely honest, probably when the avoidant attacher is starting to love bomb the other person, because that's their way of relating. In these instances, when they're really into someone, their way of relating to you might be to shower you with interest and attention, not because they're malicious, but because that's how they've grown up. If these individuals grew up where, you know, they needed to be perfectionists and prove themselves to their parents, that's their way of interacting with you. And so when you guys get close, then this is starting to play out, because then they're getting to a stage where it's like, oh God, this is too much, this is too close. Trauma and memories and all this sort of stuff of being in an enmeshed childhood comes up, and whatever else is relevant for them too. So I'd say that's probably how I describe it in that particular instance. And then also for two avoidants that come together, the trauma bond might look very different, where it's like the two of them, you know, may feel like we're fun, we're free, we're go with the flow, but they don't have any emotional intimacy together. So it mirrors the dynamic of what they had, maybe with emotionally unavailable caregivers. And then maybe in a long-term relationship with a dismissive avoidant, you know, the trauma bond is that, you know, for the dismissive avoidant, the tone, the mood, the atmosphere is set by their emotions. You know, when they take excessive time to go to work, when they're spending all their time in their hobbies, when they're choosing not to engage with you, when you've got serious issues, like when you need to go to hospital, when your kid needs to go to school, when you're in a situation where there's an emergency and they're not showing up, and you also feel like you're trying to step on eggshells to placate their mood swings when they're feeling really, really, you know, afraid of getting closer and intimate with you. That's another example of a trauma bond. So it depends from person to person, basically, and that's how I would describe it. I think that in all these cases where insecure attachment is, and of course the anxious side is obviously, you know, there's stuff there too, which I'm not talking about, but the point simply is, I think if you have an insecure way of relating to someone, you are creating a trauma bond. That's how I would describe it. I'm oversimplifying it. There's lots of other dynamics to it as well too, but that's how I would illustrate it for the sake of this experience. Let's go through this as well. Have I missed anything here? What is protest behavior? Great question. So for those of us that have read Attached, basically protest behavior is when someone is trying to do bids of connection in a way that is not necessarily healthy. So for example, say if you're dating an avoidant attacher, they pull away, you, the anxious attacher, might start texting furiously to find out what they're doing, where they're going, why they're not messaging you. That's a form of protest behavior, because you're trying to, you know, achieve closeness in that instance. For the avoidant attacher, when they shut down, when they stonewall, when they're worried that even saying a word to you is going to make the situation worse, I guess that in a way is a form of protest behavior too, because they're just shutting down. Typically, I think we use protest behavior to describe anxious attacher behavior because it's literal protest. But it's really a way of talking about how someone is trying to stop that fear of abandonment. someone is trying to regain closeness and connection. So yeah, actually, if I go back on what I said, I think it's typically used, we see more for people who have anxious attachment because they're trying to, like I said, overcome that fear of abandonment when they feel like their partner is starting to pull away from them. But if I'm being completely honest, I feel like it's a very pejorative term that's used to describe anxious attachers who are more on the side of being very, shrill, loud, and also are begging their partners to stay with them. Not every anxious attacher is like that. Many anxious attachers actually stuff their emotions down and don't actually make a peep. And they may actually choose not to talk about anything at all because they've had bad experiences where they have brought stuff up. So I just want to take this moment here to say that, though we prefer to protest behavior as almost being like loud sort of actions, don't let it necessarily color all the behavior of anyone with insecure attachment. Let's see, what else we got here? This question mark box is filling up fast. Let's see. Going through a difficult divorce and custody issues with a dismissive avoidant. I'm sorry you're going through that. 2.5 years of stonewalling and conflict. And after clear communication and goodwill and hoping it will work, I finally decided on ruthless boundaries and transaction. Work like magic, scared of the law it seems, care to explain? Oh yeah. Yes, I can explain. Okay, I haven't talked about this much, and this is a very big example that I see a lot. Okay, let's paint an example. We'll use Jill and James again, because they seem to be going for a lot of, they've been worked out a lot today. Jill has been dating, we're actually going to change it around. James has been dating Jill for 20 years. They've had a really long marriage, and ever since they got married, Jill has just not been the same. She's been really irritable. She's pulled away anytime they get close. She just hasn't seemingly, paid attention to when James has actually got his birthday. And James, it's not like Jill has been rude about it. She just seemingly just doesn't seem to have any attention or regard for it. Jill's also just not very affectionate. Sex has stopped. Things have just become very rote and boring. Jill spends so much time with friends that James is lucky if he even gets to see her, for a date. In fact, they're not really dating anymore. Most of the intimate time is actually just, talking about what they could do, but nothing ever really happens. And it gets to the point where, they try talking about couples counseling and Jill refuses. And it just seems to be like they're in this bit of a stalemate where it feels like, oh God. And James is just getting to the point where he's like, this is not working for me, and I'm really starting to burn out now, and I'm really struggling to feel like I'm actually getting close to this person who just seemingly doesn't want to actually engage with me. Then James declares with an ultimatum, and it's just like, I can't do this anymore. I need to go. Jill's behavior does a wild 180. She starts suddenly begging for him to stay, claiming that she wants to go to therapy, and stating that she'll do anything to maintain the relationship. Is she a narcissist? No. Not necessarily. And, why has this sudden ultimatum changed everything? Well, I'm going to just say that in some cases where you are dealing with someone who has a severe avoidant attachment style, the time for boundaries comes to an end real damn fucking fast. And the time for ultimatums is very clear. If you're having boundaries with an avoidant partner and they're not budging, they're not respecting you, they're not treating you right, and they're also just doing behavior like, at worst, God forbid, cheating on you, it may get to the stage where you've done everything to try and engage with them, to talk with them, and they're just not coming to the table to talk about it. They're not going to therapy to work on it. They're continuing to do behavior to create space from the relationship, and they're not involving you with it. People burn out, and they get to a stage where they're like James, where they're like, enough, I can't do this. We either work on this or I go. This can cause the avoidant attacher's fear of abandonment to surge, and they freak the hell out. If it involves the law, they may also freak out too, because some of them don't want to feel like they're being a bad person, so it really does not work well for them in this situation. If, another example, you are having an affair with an avoidant who's married, and they're also not behaving well and communicating with you, I've seen the person who's having the affair confront their avoidant partner and say, if you don't talk to me about what's going on, I will tell your wife, boyfriend, whoever, about what's going on, and you will never hear from me again, just to get their avoidant partner to pay attention and listen. Because when that fear of abandonment hits them, it hits them like a truck, and they usually acquiesce very quickly. And in this instance, they may actually be in enough pain to want to work on themselves and go to therapy and work on this. But if they're not, this is a time where we often find people walk because they're like, nope, I'm not doing this anymore. So that's why what you're describing sounds very consistent with what we see in this particular dynamic, where it's almost like you're now dealing with someone who's got an anxious attachment. It's like, where the hell did this come from? People often get confused and say, am I dealing with a fearful avoidant? The answer is no, you're not. You're definitely dealing with a dismissive avoidant whose fear of abandonment just suddenly hit the roof, and now they're the one freaking out over the state of things. Much of the time, they don't usually want to leave you. Much of the time, they do like you and have a lot of love for you, but they don't want to get close to you. But you should not, and I'm speaking to everyone here, you should not be putting up with stuff that's affecting your mental, emotional, and even physiological well-being if it means you can't have the loving relationship that you need. If this person's walls are so damn high that they can't even let them down for even an instance, it's not fair to you. That's where it's really important to make that call and commit. Let's see. He jumped into a new relationship right after me, takes her on extravagant high-effort dates early on. Is this a sign of strong feelings? I don't know. I mean, maybe. I think it's really important to I'm going to say it here. We'd need context. I mean, if they did that with you, I would say that could be a sign of strong feelings. But is it all for show? Just so that way they can feel better about themselves that they're now able to try and do commitment? Maybe it's both. Who knows? But I'd say that the extravagant dates don't necessarily mean they'll correlate with the good feelings. Some avoidant attachers just like going on good dates because it feels like a thrill ride. So, unfortunately, I can't give a lot of answers to that one. I'd say, who knows, maybe. Let's see. Will the avoidant ever reach out in the future, especially after they enter the dating phase abruptly, which seems to go well and heading to... Sorry, let me start this again. Will the avoidant attacher ever reach out in the future, especially after they enter the dating phase abruptly, which seems to go well and heading towards exclusivity? So I'm assuming that your relationship was heading in the direction of exclusivity and then they abruptly ended things with you. So you're asking me, will they reach back around to you? They could. I mean, it's very 50-50. Some of them do, some of them don't. If you've dated a fearful avoidant, chances are it might be higher than a dismissive avoidant because they notoriously bounce back from time to time. So I'd say again, it depends. Who knows? But it's not uncommon, that's for sure. Let's see. When should I end the hot and cold situation? It's not labeled either. It's been a few months now. Honestly, I don't know. I can't really give personal advice on that situation. For me, I'm very sensitive to a hot and cold cycle, and I usually address it quite quickly. And I'm like, we need to have a chat because this is really starting to affect me, and we need to just at least talk about it. I wouldn't necessarily look. Everybody's different. Everybody's at different stages. When I was younger, I would put up with this for way too long. When I got older, I became really ruthless with it and stopped engaging with people who did that. Now I'm a little bit in between, where if it happens initially, I might just bring it to the other person's attention and see if they're willing to work on it. If not, it's usually a clear dead giveaway sign that it's like game over. There's no hope here. So that's generally how I go about it. But again, I don't know your situation. Are you in a relationship with this person? Are you just dating with this person? You probably would be best to speak to a specialist about it. You can speak to one of my team members. They'd be happy to help you out because that's a little too personal for me to answer. Let's see. How many leave, come back? Sorry, let me repeat this entire thing again. How many cycles do a fearful avoidant typically do when they when they leave and come back a situationship or relationship? I can't answer that. I've heard cases where some of them have gone on for as long as 20 years. So, if you can quantify the 20 years of a situationship, a situationship that's gone on for 20 years, that's where I'd say, it's gone on for a long time. Some people will have, very spread out cycles with the fearful avoidant. Other people will have them more sporadically. So I can't give you the exact number because the answer is it's a lot. And sometimes it's more than I care to count in the sense that there's numerous cycles of this. So bear that in mind, that a lot of these things are paid with the price of time. And if you're a woman and are looking for kids, well, I think you know where I'm going with that. Let's see. Difference between just not into you and avoidant, with just out of respect because I've already mentioned it today. For those of you who want to see that, please check the beginning of the video, which I will upload this live, and you can check that out because spent the entire live talking about that at the beginning, so you'll get a thorough answer on that. Let's see. How to differentiate between a dismissive avoidant and a fearful avoidant. So the dismissive avoidant typically has a high view of self and a low view of others, meaning they think they have a very strong self-esteem. They have a very, seemingly sturdy exterior. They're usually people who, feel like they look and sound like they're quite competent, in charge, and we often find that these individuals don't have that low self-esteem being as visible as the fearful avoidance. The dismissive avoidants do not have such an active fear of abandonment. They still fear abandonment, but it's buried deep. And we often find for these individuals, there's greater tendency for them to experience alexithymia. They also have a tendency to be far more aloof and rigid. And they also seemingly have high rationalizations where they tend to be far more rational versus emotional thinkers. So typically, that's my very reductive way of saying they're very different from the more erratic, the more dysregulated, fearful avoidance. The dismissive avoidance is still dysregulated, but they usually look more cool and also collected. They often exude a very calming energy to those that are around them, and it seems like they're very put together and nothing would faze them, but usually they're masking a lot of suppressed emotions, and so often it can feel at times like you're talking to a robot, even though that may not always be the case. I want to take a very clear moment here to say there has been, according to some journal studies, they've said people who are on one side of the autistic spectrum are more likely to develop a dismissive avoidant attachment style, but I want to make it clear, just because some avoidant attachers may have blank affect does not necessarily mean they are autistic, and many individuals with autism can also exhibit an anxious or even a disorganized attachment style. So just wanted to make that claim there in case we get it twisted, because it's a lot more complicated than that. Let's see. And sorry, one last thing I wanted to say about fearful avoidance, because I didn't answer this. Fearful avoidance, we typically see that they exhibit strong, anxious attacher-like behavior. They come across very hard and fast at times too in dating and relationships. And we also find that these individuals are much more passive-aggressive and also can be quite mean and scathing to their partners. Their fear of abandonment is also characterized by mistrust and betrayal. So typically we see these individuals are far more erratic, not only with their relationships with you, but also with a lot of other people as well too. So please bear in mind that for people who have a fearful avoidant attachment style, that it is often a sign that there is heavy dysregulation coming up to the surface, and they usually wear a lot of their emotions on their sleeve much of the time. Some other cases, maybe not. But we typically see that they don't have that what we call apparent self-esteem that the dismissive avoidants have, where it looks like they're kings and queens of the world. Let's see. In what ways do anxiously attached people detach in the relationship? I did do this sometimes in my marriage to my now ex-avoidant husband. I think it came from resentment of their hot and cold behaviors, but I blame myself a lot for this being the root cause. Ooh, that's a really powerful thing that you've mentioned. Oh gosh, that is such a good point that I actually haven't answered this before. Depends on the anxious attacher. I've actually seen how some anxious attachers, even in secure relationships, if they've had a lot of history of CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, they may have a bad habit of daydreaming, disassociating, and also fantasizing about a future and a better partner. So I have seen even some anxious attachers, when they're dating a dismissive avoidant, they can get into their head about, a sexier alternative, and it means that they don't necessarily, connect with the person that they're with. Worse, and this is a very common behavior you would have seen a lot in people in previous generations. I'm sure people would have seen this in especially women who are mums dating dismissive avoidant dads, where, like, this is a classic example, especially if you grew up in the UK, you've got like the dismissive avoidant dad who's sort of just like the authoritarian in the house, and everyone sort of just like bends around his emotional unavailability. And for the anxiously attached wife, she overworks. She's fixated on the ironing. She's cleaning up the house excessively. The house doesn't need that much cleaning, but she's just going at it, and she's just pouring all of her energy into this home environment to make sure that it's looking spotless, so she doesn't have to deal with the discomfort of the fact that she's in a very uncomfortable relationship with her partner. This is one of the ways in which, I'm going to use a word that one of my clients said, which was brilliant, is a way that anxious attachers somatize their anxiety. They externalize their anxiety by pouring all their efforts into their tasks around them, so that way they don't have to feel the distress inside of them. Great term. I'm going to use that going forward. The other type that I often see too, and this is very common for anxiously attached people, is binge eating. We tend to get into a lot of bad habits where we eat a lot of sugar, carbs, and we then end up having a lot of issues where we crave food when we're feeling stressed in an environment where we're dating someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style, or even just a fearful avoidant too. Like, stress will do that to a lot of people, to be honest. And you don't have to have an anxious attachment style to have binge eating challenges as well too. But yeah, generally speaking, I find that a lot of anxious attachers, we have our own ways of avoiding our distress if we're not exhibiting those classic protest behaviors that I described earlier. This is such a fabulous question. Thank you so much for raising this. I think that one thing I'll end here is to say that this particular question is that a lot of anxious attachers can fall into a bad habit of not accepting reality for what it is with the partner that they're dating. In these kind of instances, instead of addressing the elephant in the room, they'll find ways to avoid the discomfort, to avoid having to have the conversation, and it just builds up so much stress, anxiety, resentment. I'm going to just take a moment here to give an anecdote and say many people do develop a lot of physical issues as a consequence of this. There is, a lot of correlations to high cholesterol, high blood pressure, a lot of physical ailments as a consequence of putting up with this. Please speak to a professional if you're in this situation, because this is really important to think about your health in this particular way. Take it from someone who's working on their health right now. Let's see. My favorite question. What is the difference between a narcissist and avoidant attacher? Oh, here we go. I apologize if I sound exhausted talking about this, because it's just such an exhaustive question to answer, but I'm happy to answer it. So, a person who is a narcissist, as classified with narcissistic personality disorder, has grandiosity, entitlement, has a lot of exploitation of those around them. You would see that not only with the person they're dating, but also in all other areas of their life. We typically find that narcissists have, a grandiose or covert or malignant or overt or somatic or a combination of the above in their personality style and the way that they display things. There's also communal narcissists and a whole range of others, but that's sort of like the spectrum of narcissism per se. And we can also have people who have high narcissistic traits. Now, narcissism is being researched by people like Dr. Ramani and described as not a disorder, but a personality style. And I personally like the way this conversation is going, because her argument is that if it was a disorder, it would be curable, and therefore we could be able to treat these individuals, but the research seems to suggest that we can't. So it's not really a disorder, it's more of, due to trauma or severe neglect, a personality has formed in such a way where this is the shape of this particular part of the individual. So with that in mind, personality is not the same as attachment. But I also want to make a note here to say that in a lot of my videos, I do talk about behavior of people who have avoidant attachment, and occasionally I'll talk about anxious attachment too. But interestingly enough, a lot of these individuals who have avoidant attachment and anxious attachment may be quite similar in terms of the way they relate when they're under a lot of what we call relational stress. They may not display these patterns of behavior unless they're in positions with people where this stuff comes out. However, when you are dating a narcissist, usually their stuff comes out including the relational stress and with other areas of their life as well too. Meaning that the average avoidant attacher is triggered by intimacy and closeness, adverse emotions. The anxious attacher is more triggered by fears of abandonment and also committing to a wholesome relationship. There are a few other things to throw in there too. But a narcissist is more triggered by a whole spectrum of other things too. Loss of external validation, feeling out of, I don't know where that came from. That's first for me. That's hilarious. Feeling a loss of supply, feeling that they are not getting the respect they deserve, feeling like they are not the center of attention. Some narcissists, like the covert narcissists, don't really care about that as much. But essentially, there's more to it. There's also pathological lying, and yes, avoidants can lie as well too, but there's also chronic gaslighting. There's huge devaluing episodes. Like after they love bomb you, they'll start to pick away at your self-esteem gradually over time to the point where you just become a shell of yourself. Another big tactic that we see in people who have narcissism is they isolate you. They find ways to, get you out of interacting with your friends, your family. You don't feel as good. You don't sound as good. You may end up doing all manner of things to try and placate this individual who you're dating in order to not leave, for them to not leave you. These are the individuals where they might, get a whiteboard out just to explain why you're such a terrible human being. It basically takes a lot of the attachment issues and dials it up to a 10. If the attachment stuff that I talk about is in, yes, it's a severe category, but then when you go from severe into narcissism land, you've then gone into a very, very different territory where severe land is just like the Wild West. You've now gone to the seven rings of hell where it's like, oh God, you've just gone into a whole new dimension of issues. That's the way I see it. I know, and I've read somewhere that like some people are like, oh, well, avoidants are all narcissists. And I'm like, no, no, they're not. My personal opinion is being someone with avoidant attachment, like I said, it's just an attachment issue. You may have high narcissistic traits as part of your personality. Does not mean you have narcissistic personality disorder or a narcissistic style. That is my comprehensive answer to this question because it is frankly an exhaustive one. I see it happen all the damn time where people are saying they're one and the same. And it's like, I've had so many clients who've dated narcissists and then gone on to date an avoidant, and they've said the experiences was night and day difference. And I will also add too, just as a reminder, that narcissists can have anxious attachment too, and also disorganized attachment. So just putting it out there that we can't be blaming the avoidant attachers as if they're all malignant bastards and bitches, because the reality is they're not. They can do terrible things, but guess what? Good people can do terrible things. As I've said many times, the pathway to hell is often paved with good intentions. So just putting it out there and saying we're all capable of doing crap from time to time doesn't make us a cluster B personality disorder. Let's see. Have I missed anything in this question mark box? I don't believe that I have. No, so I guess I can go back to answering some of these questions that are in the chat, and then I'm going to call it a day. Okay, so again, I just want to say thank you for those of you that have joined this conversation. It's gone longer than I thought it was going to go for, but it's been great, and I've really enjoyed doing this. All right. Do avoidants with toxic amnesia actually do not remember half the things they say, or is it just a manipulation tactic and gaslighting? No, the average avoidant is probably just suppressing and compartmentalizing a lot of that to just avoid accountability and responsibility, meaning that a lot of them, okay, think of it like this. When you are trying to be, okay, imagine you're in a child in a pretty emotionally unavailable household environment, right? And you know that your parents reward obedience, perfectionism, and they punish mistakes and also disobedience very hard. You might have grown up in a very militant childhood environment where you have adapted and learned to be the golden child to make sure that nothing is wrong. One unfortunate trait that can develop for people who have avoidant attachment is massive impression management, where they need to show up perfectly to people outside of their parental relationships. Meaning they will go to any effort, including lie, in order to make sure that the person sees them in the best light possible. This can mean that they may be very selective of the information they share with their partners. And also the people around them. So if they've just shut down and they're trying to maintain good boy, good girl, good person status, your time together may be a bit of a blemish in their reputation that they don't want to necessarily acknowledge and also own up to. It can be very hard for these individuals who strive for perfection to honor mistakes made on their pathway to try and be mummy or daddy's best boy, girl, individual. So please bear in mind, it can happen, unfortunately, and you don't need to be a narcissist in order to do that sort of stuff. It does happen. I have clients who have done this, and unfortunately, it's an adaptive style. It's not a personality disorder all the time. Avoidant monkey branching because of falling out of love. I'm assuming that is a double question, or am I not? No, that looks like it's just a question. Avoidant monkey branching because of falling out of love. I'm going to do my best to interpret that this is asking the question, why do avoidants monkey branch after falling out of love? And the answer is because they want to move on, so that way they don't feel bad about themselves. They often may have a period of time where they miss you, but they don't want to actually feel those emotions because it feels like weakness. They don't want to feel adverse feelings. So one of the best ways to overcome it, get with someone new. Look like everything's hunky-dory. Show that they can do commitment. It's their way of not having to deal with the discomfort going on inside of them. They're very good at moving forward, but very bad at moving on. Meaning they don't usually process a lot of their emotions unless they go to therapy. So just wanted to answer that one. I've heard there is a link between borderline personality disorder and fearful avoidance. Okay, I've seen this too, and this is something I want to address. I've seen a lot of people now going on the bandwagon being like, all avoidants are cluster B and are likely covert borderline personality disordered individuals. I don't think that's the case. Again, people with borderline personality disorder, for those that you don't know, suffer extreme emotional dysregulation. And it's true that a lot of them can also have a disorganized attachment style. And I'm not going to go into describing borderline personality disorder because it's a very complex personality disorder to describe. And I also just don't have a lot of information on it. But generally speaking, I would say it's going to depend from person to person. I know a friend who does have borderline personality disorder and a fearful avoidant attachment style, but I've met a lot of people who have a disorganized attachment style who don't also have borderline personality disorder. So it is case by case. And I think a lot of people love to use these diagnostic labels hand in hand to be like, they're one and the same. And it's like, no, they're really not. And again, this is a reason why we need to educate ourselves so we actually understand this. Like sometimes it just kind of annoys me when I see people oversimplifying this stuff. It's like, guys, please pick up your textbooks, your research, and take a look at this. I know you're in distress. I know you want to understand this. I know you want to simplify it, but sometimes it's not that simple. It's a lot more comprehensive and complex than that. Maybe one day in the future I'll be wrong. Maybe in the future we'll find out, that actually all avoidants are narcissists. All disorganized attachers have borderline personality disorder. But so far, doesn't look like that's necessarily the case. We also have to remember too that complex post-traumatic stress disorder can also mirror a lot of the signs and symptoms of someone who has a borderline personality disorder. So please bear in mind too that it's very easy for these emotional dysregulated episodes to come from a place of CPTSD rather than a personality disorder as well too. So just putting it out there as well. Define a Phantom X. So a Phantom X is part of a deactivation strategy that an avoidant attacher does in order for them to essentially create emotional space from the person that they're currently seeing. Let's go back to Jack and Jill. I think I've changed his name a few times. I think he was Jim. We're going to call him Jim. Jim has been dating Jill now for about 2 years. And even though they're getting closer, Jim finds himself fantasizing about his previous ex, Maria. Jim, ended that relationship where he said Maria was crazy. She was shouting all the time. She was toxic. All she wanted to do was complain about him all the time, about how he would never communicate properly with her, and he couldn't stand it and he left her. And he still sounds pretty bitter to it. However, as time went on, Jim got to the point where as he was developing a closer relationship with Jill, and Jill, to her credit, both of them have been forming a great relationship. It looks great, it feels great, but Jim's gotten to a point where he's, feeling really anxious about growing intimacy and commitment. And as a way to help him overcome this, he's now flooded with a lot of nostalgia for the time he spent with Maria. Oh, sure, those times weren't that bad. Maybe he actually still has feelings for Maria. Maybe if he goes back, he'll actually be able to work on this. Maybe it'll be different this time. This is a deactivation strategy. It's a very insidious one, and it's one where a lot of these individuals may find themselves essentially fantasizing and also going through a bit of a dopamine hit, thinking about a previous partner. Similar to what I was describing a little bit before with the anxious attacher who dissociates into fantasy land over an imaginary sexy partner. This is what's happening to them on a much greater scale, and they may use that as a justification to leave a relationship. It's a pretty brutal one for a lot of people, so that's the way the Phantom X usually goes. And I should let you know, if they get back if Jim goes back with Maria, usually doesn't get better the second time around. Usually it's just more of the same. Thank you for the community you've created here. You are helping people every day. Thank you. I really appreciate your kind words. Oh, here we go. We've got a big question. Thoughts on sending an email to a fearful avoidant, wishing them well and thanking them for the relationship if you genuinely feel healed and want to close the chapter with grace and love? Go ahead, do it. I know I'm not meant to give advice, but I'm just going to say, I'm not going to stop you for doing that. Since you weren't able to do in the moment of the abrupt breakup, I know my fearful avoidant attacher loved me, and I want to move on knowing we ended in a way that honors the relationship despite the abrupt ending. I don't see any problem with that. Seriously, guys, if you want to send a letter to your avoidant partner, I ain't going to stop you. I think there's a time and a place for it, and that's when there's a real amount of emotional distance between the two of you. I think sending it when you're still in that phase of being like, I miss them, I want them back, I'm mad at them, is never a good place to be doing it from. But if you're doing it because you feel like you moved on, you're not looking to get back with them, you're just looking to honor the experience, I'm just going to say now, what is the worst that's going to happen? But the one thing I'm going to say to anyone who does this, and this is a key thing, if they reach out to you, you need to have bloody good boundaries in place. Especially if it's a fearful avoidant who you had multiple cycles with. If they reach out and you feel like it's starting to grow intimate again and you don't want to necessarily go back there, my recommendation as someone who'd been in this, I haven't been in this situation, but if I were to go in this situation, I would say, I don't want to necessarily re-engage. And even if we were to, I'd say we both need to go to couples counseling to work on this. Because there ain't no way I'd want to go back through a cycle of that if this other individual wasn't working on themselves. It's not fair to me. So yeah, just wanted to say that. I see someone here says, if you were really healed, you would never ever feel this urge to reconnect or send this email. Don't agree. And I'll tell you why. I have actually found it very cathartic to actually send that email, and it may be on the pathway to feeling more distanced and removed from it. I understand where this person's coming from because it seems like it's, the state of well, if you still feel the need to send this, then clearly you have some emotional attached to that. But we've got to remember that the pathway to healing is not black and white. It's this state of too many feelings, no feelings for the other person. Often at times, it's this roller coaster that goes up and down to the point where it becomes less insane, and then it just sort of petters out to the point where your attachment to that person flatlines. And if that person feels like they're in a bit of a hump where they're just I just need to get this off my chest, that can actually be the little gap that brings them into indifference because they're tick, done, I can move on now. I wish them well. I've moved on from it. I can bury this behind me. So I understand where you're coming from with that, but I think we can offer a bit of compassion to this person. And let's see, what else we got here? Can an anxious attacher person develop dismissive avoidant attachment over time? Oh God. Okay, this is a great question. I'm gonna answer this one based on the literature and the research I've read. Short answer is no. Not from what I've seen, but attachment styles are also changeable. So hear me out on this one. I would imagine for that anxious attacher, they'd have to have been put in an environment for years where they are essentially forced into a state where their attachment style did a huge 180 and they became a dismissive avoidant. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because, yes, though attachment styles are flexible, the way we relate to other people depends on their attachment related to ours and how it activates us in certain situations. But when it comes to all of us, I'd say, we have a dominant attachment style that has been ingrained since the good old days of growing up. So for you to go all the way over there, I actually don't even think it's possible. Because think about it like this. You'd have to learn how to compartmentalize. You'd have to learn how to essentially shut off a lot of those emotions. You'd have to get to a stage where you're that good at having alexithymia. You'd have to be in a position where you become so rational that your brain isn't able to work through a lot of that emotional stuff. I mean, sure, it might be possible in an adult setting, but usually a lot of this stuff was hardwired into us when we were kids. So for a lot of that unconscious programming and stuff to go on over time for us to turn into that, I haven't seen a research paper that suggests that there's been an anxious attacher who's gone all the way to a dismissive avoidant attachment style. Maybe it's possible, but to me, I think a lot of these things happened to us when we were kids, and it happened very unconsciously. And I'm also curious about the role of genetics to see if maybe we go one way or the other, as well as being influenced by trauma, abuse, chaotic environments, people in general. So yeah, that's my answer to that one. It's a great question, but I don't have a clear answer on it. I want to also make a point here. A lot of people love to say, well, your attachment styles can change, as if to say it's like, this rubber band that just keeps bending. Not that, yes, you can become an earned, secure person, but it's not like your attachment style just does these crazy zigzag sort of things in a relationship or with other people all the time. Like I said, you usually have your dominant style that is still going to have what I call scars that you heal over time through trauma recovery. But it's one of those things where it's not like we see people have these wacky attachment styles that just come out of nowhere and go from disorganized to just preoccupied anxious to then dismissive avoidant. Because there's so much there's such a neurobiological component to this as well. And there's also the trauma influence as well too. That's where I'm I think it's a bit more complicated than some influences and books are saying, where it's it just changes. It's no, not that much it doesn't. And it does take sometimes a long time to heal. How do you work on protest behaviors if you have them? For example, if the avoidant pulls away and you become real anxious. Great question. So if you're, so let's define a protest behavior. Let's say, I'm going to use these guys again. Let's say Jill and Jim have been going out for a while, and Jill's gotten to the point where she's fed up with Jim constantly, just not wanting to engage with her over discussion. And Jill's just shouting, being you always choose to walk away from you, never care about our relationship, etc. The first thing you need is a bit of humility to be okay, is this helping or not? Sure, Jim's behavior is probably not helping, but you need to do things differently going forward. And so the first thing is to accept the fact that maybe the strategy you're looking for to try and create connection may not be working out for you. So the next step that you can do is also do some research, speak to a therapist to come up with some new ways to interact with Jim in this particular example. And then what you can do is you can then start trying those out as well too. Role play with friends, a therapist, and try alternative ways of engaging with your partner to see if anything changes. It may or it may not. The hope is it does. If it doesn't, We got to accept the situation for what it is. So that's part of it there. When the severe avoidant attacher reaches out after months or years, how often do they apologize? How often do they apologize properly? Isn't it a litmus test to assess if reflection and growth has happened? Ooh. Okay, so I'm going to rephrase this question. I'm assuming this is asking, like, how long should we wait to determine whether or not their apology is legitimate? My answer is we'd actually need context. Years apart may suggest that this person has taken some time to have some self-reflection, but what does that self-reflection look like? Has it been therapy for 5 years or an ayahuasca trip for 2 months? Very different forms of healing and also working through stuff. And usually I'd argue that one person's journey for self-enlightenment does not necessarily match another's, where they're actually realizing, I have some people that I need to apologize. So I'd say years apart, 5+ years apart, probably a good sign. Is it necessarily a sign that they've changed? No. We need a lot more context to determine that. Excuse me. I wouldn't use the years apart necessarily as a litmus test to suggest they've necessarily changed. Let's see, what else have we got here? I think I'm nearly done with everything that's been written here as well too, and I could probably go through it. Are there any books on CPTSD that you can recommend? Thanks for these lives. Yes, my absolute favorite is by Pete Walker. He wrote a book called From Surviving to Thriving, talking all about complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I might just write that in the chat. Pete Walker, Surviving to Thriving, and I think the title of the book is literally titled CPTSD. Phenomenal read, highly recommend it. Please go check it up. It's one of the best books on this that I've read, and it has some excellent techniques that you can use to challenge a lot of the things that come up for you, so highly recommend it. Let's see what else we got here. Thank you for these lives. They're awesome. You're very welcome. I enjoy doing them. It's always a lot of fun chatting with everyone who's going through this. Let's see. What else do we have here? Are you planning to post more content on disorganized attachment? I did one video a while ago, and I'm not like dying to do another one again anytime soon. I try and vary these up just because I'm a big person who needs variety in my life, and I need to try and change the things that I do. Otherwise, I get bored real quick. So it's important, I think, to be able to just, talk to things that I feel called to talk about. So maybe I'll revisit again and do like a different talk about the same topic, but I'm not really like dying to talk about disorganized or fearful avoidance, specifically in and of themselves, unless I'm like, oh, that's something that I really haven't talked about that I'm dying to get off my chest. So yeah. Let's see. Do we have anything else here? I can see that there's 4 more questions. All right, I'm going to reply to the last 4 of these questions, and I'm going to call it a day. So, is monkey branching a relationship a good start for a healthy relationship? No. Not if it's an avoidant attacher. Hell no. Some people do bounce from relationship to relationship as a way of avoiding grief. And that is a recipe for disaster because you're still carrying the emotional corpse of a previous relationship with you. You're going to need to do something with that. Now, granted, some people do get into secure relationships off the back of doing a literal monkey branch or even cheating on their partner. It can happen. But the amount of legwork both partners need to do in order to make that work is tremendous. I know people where they have monkey branched, and in those dynamics, they've had to spend so many hours in therapy to overcome their respective stuff to get it to the point where it actually works. So I don't want to say, no, it never works out well. It's just unwise to do that. That's the answer I'd have to that. Let's see. What else we got here? I really feel... Oh, wait, sorry. This is all part of... It's a one big thing. Do they ever miss us after a long time, even if all contacts are cut? As in they've like blocked you, for instance. My answer is yes, they can. A lot of them can often have time where they miss you but don't want to necessarily express that they miss you. A lot of them might have a moment where you become the Phantom X. So yes, it can happen. I really feel that his fondness was genuine. Can it be? I think so. I mean, look, I genuinely like to believe that a lot of the fondness avoidant attaches is genuine because I think that it really speaks to our intuition. I think that, much of the time we like to feel like, we like to say things like, no, it's fake, it wasn't real, in an attempt to try and avoid having to sit with the discomfort of the experience that we had. But if it was really that fake, I think that we'd pick it up. Our bodies and our minds are smarter than we give them credit for. And I think a lot of the time we dismiss the experience we had as if to say like, oh, these people were players and they never cared at all. But I actually think that a lot of the time that enthusiasm, that glee, that almost childlike fondness for you is very, very real in that stage of dating. Last question for the night. Can these traits show up in an adult age and not be present during a teenage years? Yes, because you got to think about it like this. During those years as a teenager, your personality, your attachment styles are still being molded quite heavily. So you may not display those same sort of attachment styles that we would see in an adult in quite the same way. But the strange test, that was the test that helped us to determine a child's relationship with their parent, could demonstrate how certain children reacted to different, to their parents, depending on, when they were stepping away from them. So it doesn't mean to say that those traits weren't there. We also have to think about, the circumstances as well too, like what was going on at that particular point in time. Were you guys and girls close as friends or even as intimate partners? There's a lot of context of this too. So I'm not here to say they couldn't, it's not to say like they were never there. It just may be to say they were maybe more mild or not as omnipresent as they now are. I will say that untreated attachment styles can usually go one of two ways. If the person's willing to work on this stuff, it will obviously hopefully get better. But if the person isn't, let's just say that it could go the other way real quick. So, got to be really careful if you aren't taking accountability for this sort of stuff. All right, everybody, thank you for joining this live, discussing They're Just Not That Into You. I know that was like the first 10, 15 minutes of this, and now the bulk of it's just been Q&A, and that's the way I roll. But I wanted to thank you all for participating in this experience. It's always great chatting with you guys. I'll be back next week with more content, and I hope everyone has a wonderful time wherever they are, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Goodbye.